We are watching North Korean troops move to the front line. There are still a few weeks left for the Russian and North Korean units to coordinate before they take part in combat. However, this day is already very, very close, according to our military intelligence. So, I would like to ask you how you think the appearance of units from the DPRK at the front could affect both the course of hostilities and the reaction of our partners. What could be the role of these North Koreans in the fighting? The Russians are certainly planning to significantly strengthen their reserves. This is obvious. By the way, our soldiers from Silidov report that, indeed, just these days, just yesterday or the day before, additional reserves were brought to the Russians in this area. Therefore, they can afford to spend a much larger number of personnel in such seemingly pointless assaults. At the same time, they are literally throwing cannon fodder at us. So their attacks and assaults are coming wave after wave, which happens every 20 minutes. It is clear that it is impossible to fight at such a pace if you do not plan to replenish or do not aim to stop the fighting. Any army, even the largest, even the Russian army, will simply run out of manpower in such an intensive mode. We understand that they are planning to use these North Koreans in the Kurdish region and from the Kurdish direction to transfer them to the Pokrovsk direction to reinforce the Russian assault units in Ukraine. So, we will see that Putin would certainly like to use this professional infantry, light assault infantry, directly in combat. However, whether he decides to take this step depends on many factors. We see that the talks between Washington and Moscow are continuing, with White House spokespeople and Secretary Austin confirming that they have finally seen these North Koreans in Russia. This happened after a week of statements by our intelligence. However, the question is how they will be used. In other words, the pressure from Washington continues, and the Americans will do everything possible to prevent additional escalation so that the North Korean army does not participate in a direct battle. This allegedly somehow justifies North Korea's participation in the war on the side of the Russian Federation. However, the main thing is that our military intelligence has been actively communicating this topic for a week now, actually informing all our global partners. We see that South Korea immediately joined in, an official Seoul at the level of the president and with all their intelligence agencies confirmed this information. In fact, information pressure is being created, primarily on Washington, because decisions need to be made, a response needs to be prepared, perhaps symmetrically. This is what the current administration is most afraid of. We also have questions for our European partners. We see that Germany is expressing its dissatisfaction with North Korea through diplomatic channels. An active process is underway among our Western partners to develop a solution. По дипломатичних каналах передає свої невдоволення Північній Кореї. Тобто зараз іде такий активний процес. What the Western coalition's response should be. Випрацювання рішення. Тобто якою має бути відповідь від західної коаліції. Serhiy, you are talking about this kind of pressure, behind the scenes or diplomatically, on North Korea, and attempts to avert inevitable events. I apologize for the tautology. For a long time, the White House commented cautiously on the transfer of North Korean troops to Russia, stating they had no evidence of such a transfer. Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence have publicly confirmed for over a week that the transfer is occurring and its purpose is clear. John Kirby, the White House security representative, stated that it's unclear how the North Koreans will be used at the front. This raises questions, as it's hard to see why thousands of North Korean soldiers would be transferred and trained in Russia if not for combat. Kirby suggests that using North Korean troops in combat would be a desperate move by Putin. Do you agree this reflects desperation rather than strength, showing that Russia's resources, along with its allies, are greater than those of the West? Also, has the recent U.S. pressure on North Korea been effective? Because we are still seeing that, despite this pressure, North Korean troops are gradually approaching the front line and may be thrown into combat in the coming days. First, there is the obvious question. Putin has received a very rough slap in the face just by the very fact of the existence of the Kurdish bridgehead and our successful Kurdish operation, which has been going on continuously for 3 months. So in fact, he invited the leaders of the BRICS format, which is about 36 top leaders of the world, to make sure that they are on the territory of the Russian Federation, to see that part of the Russian Federation. According to our general staff and our commander-in-chief,
світу для того, щоб вони тут, на території Російської Федерації, переконалися в тому, що частина Російської Федерації, згідно замислу нашого...
turns out to be beyond the control of Putin and official Moscow.
...виявляються непідконтрольні Путіну і офіційній Москві.
That is, all these victorious statements about Putin taking Vuhledar, gaining a certain number of kilometers and settlements, simply do not have any weight for the same autocrats and dictators whom Putin invited to his summit in Kuzan, Tatarstan. In this case, the Kursk operation did not only avert the threat from Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv, but also had a geopolitical impact on the world's largest countries. The question is that Putin, as it turned out, has no reserves to eliminate this Kursk bridgehead.
Але питання в тому, що в Путіна, як виявилось, немає резервів для того, щоб ліквідувати ось цей Курський плацдарм.
The entire Leningrad military district, the entire north grouping of troops, which was supposed to threaten NATO, was unable to squeeze out a seemingly small grouping of our troops in the Kursk region. For this purpose, combat units were redeployed from the territory of Ukraine from the south, that is, Marines and airborne assault units. But they were unable to carry out this operation. It failed. It turns out that despite the seemingly enormous mobilization reserve that Putin was scaring everyone with, these 4 million, the Russians are not able to mobilize it in time to carry out a really relatively small operation. They had to involve the troops of a foreign dictatorial country. In general, as a general rule, any dictator does not tolerate the troops of a foreign country. Lukashenko is sensitive about the presence of Russian troops in Belarus, as it undermines his sovereignty and authority. Putin must publicly acknowledge that he cannot maintain the war's current pace or achieve his minimum goals. Currently, Russian forces haven't even reached our main defense lines along the Pokrovsk-Mirnorad border. To maintain the current fighting pace, the Russians now need to involve North Koreans, indicating they lack sufficient forces. Leaders like the Chinese, Brazilian president, and Saudi Crown Prince are clearly observing this. Notably, the Brazilian president and Saudi Crown Prince did not attend the summit, highlighting Putin's inability to achieve his political goals through war. The decisive role of our general staff and military and political leadership helped in all this. Now the question is, what to do? After all, there is no other way out but to engage the North Korean army. And the question is how to use it. Questions are already arising here, as we have heard the ridiculous excuse that the Americans do not yet know how the North Korean army will be used. But it is clear that a one-time reinforcement of 10,200 personnel on any part of the front will pose a serious threat to us. The most important thing is that what we know about this threat, as it turned out, is a problem for our Western partners. If the GUR communicates in the public space the presence of North Korean troops, it means that all other channels, and I should note that the intelligence service works through its own specific, that is, internal, secret channels of information exchange. This means that our intelligence has informed its Western colleagues, primarily the Americans, about the threat. But there has been no response. The DIU is now forced to conduct public communication through open media to put pressure and speed up decision-making by our Western partners.
Зауважу лише, що розвідка працює по своїм специфічним, тобто внутрішнім таємним каналам обміну інформації, і це означає, що наша розвідка...
What we see is really a delay and a rather sluggish position. We hope that the position of our Western partners will change. We see that it is difficult for Putin to wage war, but he is still waging it and has the resources to do so. He himself says that he is ready to put everything on the line, to put it bluntly, to continue this war. So, in fact, we now officially have a third country involved in a full-scale invasion. The DPRK troops have already been deployed. Yes, they are still in the Kurdish region, but this does not mean that these troops will not cross the Ukrainian border and get somewhere in the Kovska direction or in the south of our country in a few days.
Поставити там на карту, грубо кажучи, для того, аби продовжувати цю війну. І, власне, ми фактично, що ми маємо на сьогоднішній день, ми маємо
One way or another, these troops will be deployed, as there is already an agreement. What do we have now? Absolutely no reaction from the European Union, who are just deeply concerned. In particular, yesterday, the official of the European Union, High Representative Josep Borrell, articulated his reaction. He said that he was concerned about the information about everything that was happening, and he spoke about it in the future tense, which has not yet been proven. He says that it would be a serious violation of international law if these DPRK troops are on the territory of the country, including the most fundamental principles of the UN Charter. It would be a unilateral hostile act by the DPRK with serious consequences for European and global peace and security.
Серйозним порушенням міжнародного права, якщо все ж таки ці війська КНДР будуть на території країни, в тому числі найфундаментальніших принципів статуту ООН, і це буде односторонній ворожий акт з боку КНДР.
He called on the DPRK to cease all actions, but this call is obviously not enough. As we can see, the European Union will coordinate its response. So at the moment, we have a reaction in the form that they are still thinking about how to respond. What can this reaction of our allies, European allies, NATO countries, and the United States lead to?
Реакцію ЄС у тому вигляді, що вони будуть ще думати, як на це реагувати. До чого взагалі може призвести ось така ніяка...
Could this give Putin such a green light that he can, in principle, involve someone else in this war, and there will be no special reaction? We have seen since 22 that the lack of a tough reaction always leads to another round of escalation.
Ми ж бачимо з 22-го року, що відсутність жорсткої реакції, вона завжди призводить до чергового витка ескалації. Тобто, от той принцип деескалації та політика деескалації.
This is the principle of de-escalation and the policy that Washington is constantly trying to promote, where additional weapons are perceived as a possible escalation and additional long-range capabilities are also considered an escalation. This is a truly insignificant position when we are simply artificially blocked from launching long-range strikes. Even knowing that there are more than 300 facilities on Russian territory that can be hit by these missiles does not stand up to any criticism. Any excuses are simply worthless. So yes, of course, the lack of a tough response to the actions of the Russians in 2022 led to their wave of mobilization. I'm talking about the fall of 2022. Moreover, they were able to build their military infrastructure as early as 2023. We are talking about the entire Serhiy line and the entire south. In 2024, we see that they have not only accumulated their troops here. That is, they have increased their production of missiles and drones, objectively. But moreover, they are also involving third countries. And here we are talking about regular large-scale supplies of weapons and now people from North Korea. All of these persuasions and attempts to negotiate with Iran on the supply of Iranian missiles and technology are, of course, obvious. Every inaction is a step towards escalation, and the Russians are attracting additional resources. Unfortunately, this is the policy of our current partners, and this policy is, of course, changed by the president during his visits and when he presents his own plan for victory. The public discussion, as well as our entire security forces, informing about the intentions and plans of the Russians and their every move, demonstrate an example of how to pursue a peaceful policy, how to strike the Russians, and that it is possible to cross all those red lines. This definitely does not lead to any escalation. On the contrary, I would like to remind you that the strikes on Belgorod and our Kursk operation have always led to an increase in the level of support for peace initiatives on the part of Russia. When the number of people who do not support war but support peace, according to all polls, after our successes, after strikes on Russia, always grows. This is the main conclusion we can draw after almost 3 years of war. As for more red lines and reactions that we have heard in recent days to the DPRK troops involved in the war, for example, yesterday the Hill newspaper quoted Republican Michael Turner, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, as saying,
КНДР вступлять відкрито у цю війну, то США мають розглянути можливість вжити, цитую, прямі воєнні дії.
He said that if the DPRK military openly engages in this war, the United States should consider taking, quote, direct military action. Turner called on the Biden administration to understand that there is an ongoing election story in the United States. Yes, and he is a Republican. But he nevertheless says that it needs to be made clear to the DPRK that the entry of these troops into the conflict is a red line for the United States. If it is confirmed that these troops will be on the territory of Ukraine, perhaps not in the Kursk region, but on the territory of Ukraine, then the United States should seriously consider taking direct military action against North Korean troops. How can we interpret these direct military actions? Or does it mean that some troops of our partners on the territory of our country may be involved? If North Korea can use its troops, why can't our partners use theirs? How realistic are these assessments on the battlefield? Mr. Turner isn't likely engaging in pre-election populism. Republican-led intelligence and defense committees have pressured President Biden for a clear victory plan and strategy for aiding Ukraine well before the election season. Obviously, this does not suit any self-respecting Republican to give minimal aid to keep it at a minimum level so that Ukraine does not fall. That's why the really good questions remain relevant, both 6 months ago and a year ago and now as well. The only question is that our war is with Russia. It is not somewhere in the east of Ukraine, and it makes no sense to tie it to any territories. If Kim's army participates in the Kursk operation, the Russian grouping will be redeployed to Kursk. If there are North Koreans in the Kursk region, it means that 10,000 more Russians have appeared in the Pokrovsk direction. This is a direct dependence on the participation of the North Korean army. Moreover, the presence of their experts and instructors, if they are helping to assemble a missile 1,000 kilometers from the border, cannot be a reason to turn a blind eye and say that there is no direct clash. This North Korean KN-23 missile will fly to the territory of Ukraine and cause damage. In this case, we should not be tied to whether the North Korean army is in the occupied territories of Ukraine or whether it is perhaps somewhere in the Kursk region or perhaps preparing reserves at other military facilities. All of this strengthens the combat capabilities of the Russian Federation, and the criterion now voiced applies only if there are no direct hostilities. We are in the midst of hostilities, and therefore the criterion is the destruction of all absolutely military objects on the entire territory of the Russian Federation, including even the Far East. Our capabilities, of course, must meet this criterion, and for this we need, of course, long-range weapons, our long-range capabilities. Therefore, we must put pressure on our Western partners. We need to break the Russian paradigm of "we are not there," which they have used since 2014 to justify the Russian Spring and the establishment of the LDNRs. This allowed Moscow's agents, rather than the Russian military, to seize territory and undermine our state while destroying the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These are the elements of hybrid warfare that are similar in their destructive consequences to conventional wars. To significantly reduce the number of Russians on our territory, we need to support our army and donate to the means of destroying the Russian occupiers. Together with our guest Serhiy Kuzan, we are launching a fundraiser for FPV drones for the 24th Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after King Danilo, based in Lviv region. We are collecting donations via QR code. All details are provided. Funds will go to the Ukrainian Security Centre to support the 24th Brigade with F-10s and 70 ammunition depots for our Royal Marines. Ammunition depots for our Royal Marines. UAH 200,000 has been raised, and people are actively donating. We urge you, dear viewers, to join in the fundraising and support our military who are defending Chasiv Yar. This is a critical area in Donetsk region. Please support this collection. Every donation and hryvnia is extremely important. Serhiy, let's return to our discussion. I have one more question about expectations for the coming weeks. Could North Korean troops appear at the front? We've discussed various reactions, and while Russia has been on an all-out offensive for a year, they're now deploying units they hadn't planned to use in direct assaults as their reserves dwindle. In particular, we are talking about the Pokrovsky direction, Selidov, and other parts of the front line. All of this is allegedly a calculation for Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. elections. At least there are some commentators and analysts who believe that Putin is counting on Trump coming to power and then freezing the situation to catch his breath and move on. Trump is supposed to help him with this. Do you agree with this theory, this assumption, yes, with this version? And what happens if Trump doesn't win? Does this mean that Putin will have a very difficult situation with his reserves? Can this lead to systemic problems, let's say, in the Russian army and in the Russian political leadership? No, I don't think that everything really works in such a linear fashion and that the Russians have their own Russian candidate. There are good and bad ones.
Ця адміністрація або ж адміністрація Трампа, вони будуть виходити виключно з тих реалій, які є.
This administration, or the Trump administration, will proceed solely from the realities that have developed for them. We are talking about how Trump might act. We are not saying that he is pro-Russian now, but we see in Russian propaganda clear sympathies in favor of Trump. They broadcast it without hiding it.
Президент США поводиться не так, якби Москві і Кремлю хотілося. Але цього разу, здається, знову ж таки, своїми симпатіями там на болотах визнали.
We've already made a mistake with Trump once, and then we sighed in disappointment that the U.S. president was not behaving the way Moscow and the Kremlin wanted. But this time, it seems, they have made up their minds. It's hard to say, because in general, Russians always bet on destabilizing and weakening institutions. They are looking for fault lines or conflicts in societies and try to inflate them from all sides. They support the most controversial statements, actions, or policies precisely to cause public outrage, protest, and conflict. These are the things that, according to Russian textbooks on hybrid warfare, should weaken societies, their resistance, and defense capabilities. The goal of the Russians is always conflict and destabilization. Elections, as a point of tension, a point of bifurcation of any society, are a very good opportunity for this. So I think that the Russians will continue to use their means of information, influence, diplomacy, and blackmail. But they have to be backed up by something, i.e., the situation on the front line. The main product that Russians are selling to the West today is the thesis that Putin is invincible, that his reserves are not running out, that this war is turning into a bloody meat grinder where millions of people are dying on the Russian and Ukrainian sides. Thus, this means the messages of horror, fear, and hopelessness that Russian propaganda is very actively relaying today. But to be fair, it is no longer through Russian disinformation outlets such as Sputnik or Rashide, but through Western media.
Сьогодні ретранслює російська пропаганда, але треба віддати належне, вже не через свої засоби російської дезінформації, такі як...
Thus, they are feeding what is being actively spread by the media. Not the story of victory or a realistic assessment, but rather the fear that everything is lost, the Russians are advancing, the front is breaking through, and so on. Such headlines, such articles, publications, and materials are much more widespread.
росіяни йдуть, наступають, прорив фронту і так далі. Такі заголовки, такі статті, публікації, такі матеріали, вони є набагато більш поширюваними.
So, the Russians are successfully manipulating public opinion not only here in Ukraine, but also, first of all, in the West. If we understand that this is all Russian propaganda, that objective data shows that the Russians do not have enough manpower to maintain even the pace of the war that they have taken today, that they are not even fulfilling their plans for the summer offensive campaign.
Вони не виконують навіть свої плани, своєї літньої наступальної кампанії, а я нагадаю, що...
Let me remind you that in late August, early September, they were supposed to take Selidov, and by September, they were supposed to capture Pokrovsk. So, as of now, they have not even passed Selidovo and have not approached our main defense lines. This breaks Russia's entire strategy, which of course was aimed at the election race in the United States, at destabilizing our Western partners.
Яка спрямована, звичайно ж, в тому числі і була спрямована на саміт БРІКС.
In order to continue the communication strategy they have already chosen, the Russians need to throw everything they have, all their reserves, without counting the losses. The fact that we are demonstrating combat capability and that we are disrupting the plans of the Russians means that new administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, will have to react and take into account the real strength that Ukraine is demonstrating. If this position of strength is backed up by a diplomatic position, and we have seen a clear articulation of a plan for peace and a plan for war, any administration will have to reckon with Ukraine's subjectivity, with the plan that Ukraine has declared. According to this framework, consultations will be held and a new policy towards Ukraine will be developed. This is a defensive position, but today we can already say that our defensive position has proven to be stronger than Russia's offensive position. This can be actively observed in the aftermath of the BRICS summit, when, as it turned out, the anti-Western and anti-American coalition desired by Putin was not created. There was no bellicose rhetoric from China.
Коли, як виявилося, не було створено бажаної для Путіна антизахідної, антиамериканської коаліції, не було войовничої риторики з боку Китаю, для прикладу, Бразилії, яка взагалі...
For example, Brazil did not come at all. And let me remind you that the Sino-Brazilian plan was supposed to be the main peace plan discussed at this summit and other international platforms. So we saw that there was actually no such discussion, no strong statement as a result of this summit.
Не було жодної сильної заяви в результаті цього саміту. І це означає, що всі ці спроби росіян зламати, так би мовити, зламати західну думку.
This means that all these attempts by the Russians to break the Western position and impose the position of Russia, China, India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia as something common, the position of the countries of the global south as an alternative to what they call the Anglo-Saxon world order, have failed precisely because of the successes and victories of Ukraine and Ukrainians. We have to act from a position regardless of the outcome of the American elections. Thank you, Serhiy, for this conversation about global issues.